Hello, YouTube friends. I'm going to start another project. I haven't quite finished the last one, the one with all of the multicolored 4.5 inch squares that I had the whole wall filled up. It's a big quilt, and I have to wait until a sewing day at our local church so I can put out the quilt and sandwich it on top of the tabletops. My desktop is okay for a bit smaller quilts, but not quite for the size of that one. And it makes it easier to be able to tape it down around the edges and make it nice and sturdy. So I've got everything ready, cut, folded, pressed, everything ready to make the sandwich, but I have to wait until a sewing day at the church. So in the meantime, I make one project and finish it, and then I start another project. I know I haven't quite finished the last one, but I'm starting another project. And I went to my Quilt Guild meeting last week, and one of the ladies there, Lori, she came up to me and she said, "Oh, I really enjoy your YouTube channel." And I said, "Well, thank you." But she said, "How do you come up with ideas for quilts? It seems that you do things all over the place and you're never really consistent on any one thing." Well, I think I do have a consistency on one thing, and that is using what I have. And so today I'm starting a new project, and I am going to use what I have. I have to reduce the amount of fabric that I've got. I have quite a big stash of bins, and the bins have treasured bits in them. They're not all big pieces of fabric. There's a lot of smaller pieces of fabric there. So I have to decide what I can make with the smaller pieces of fabric. And one thing that I typically don't use is an abundance of white. And I do have, as you can see here, quite a pile of white bits. Some of them are not white, they're beige, yellow beige. Some of them are gray beige. Some of them have some pattern on them. And I have a bin that has all of these bits in them. Leftover projects that people have given me their leftovers. Some of the projects that I made long ago. But white is not typically one of the colors that I use often. So I started off by looking at what was in my bin. I want to reduce the amount of fabric in that bin and keep only the pieces that are bigger pieces. Now, somebody in my last video made a comment, "Oh, you worked really hard on that quilt. Not smarter, but harder." Well, I agree. I'm not sure what not smarter means, but anytime I use a lot of leftover bits, they're small pieces, and you have to figure out how you want to use them. And in order to use them, sometimes I make 3 seams instead of just 1. Sometimes I make 5 cuts instead of just 1. I remember the first time I went to a quilt workshop, and we were given a pattern to use, and the quilters all laid out their big pieces of fabric and got their long rulers out and started cutting the fabric and had strips and strips and strips of wonderful pristine fabric. But what they did afterwards really surprised me, because what was left over, they threw it in the garbage can. They didn't keep it. Now, when I grew up, I didn't have a whole lot, and we used whatever we could use. The challenge is to make use of the things that are the leftovers, to reduce waste and reusing items that somebody has considered surplus to their needs, and looking at what goes into the waste bins. We have to try to reduce the amount of content going into that scrap pile. Scrap is that negative, I don't want it anymore, I can't use it, it's going to landfill. And that's not what I'm all about. So I'm trying to reduce waste. I'm trying to not make any unnecessary purchases. And it is a challenge to work with the things that I have. But if you look at what you want to use, then sometimes it comes to you as what you can do with it. So in my bin of white fabrics, I have lots of pieces. Now, some of them, somebody loved this piece, I'm sure, but they cut a big square out of the center and left the outside as waste fabric. That wasn't me, believe me. But when I look at these things, I try to figure out how big they are. I use my little ruler and measure them. And believe it or not, in this pile of fabric, there are a lot of fabrics that I can either cut into 5 inches or 3.5 inches. And I thought to myself, use something that's 3.5 by 5. So what I've been doing is separating the pieces, using them one at a time with my little ruler. And I've got here a pile of 2.5-inch strips. They're not long. They're not as long as the width of fabric, but they're 2.5-inch strips. Whatever wasn't long enough for a strip, I cut it into 2.5-inch squares. They'll be useful. And I also made a whole pile of 3.5 by 5-inch pieces. And this is not a square, it's a block. And I thought, I'm going to challenge myself to make something with these 3.5 by 5 inches. So when I sort through something like this, the big pieces go back into the bin and all the small pieces get repurposed. It goes somewhere, it's not going back into the bin. So I have a surplus of paper, watercolor paper, little pieces, and this book with old watercolor paintings on it just happened to have pieces of watercolor stiff paper that had the right measurements for 3.5 by 5. I've got 2 pieces here, 3.5 by 5. And on the back side, I drew a couple of lines. And that's my pattern. Because I've got in another place, I'll show you here, I have another place on my desk where I have started sorting some color to go with my whites. Now these colors came from another bin that I had, and that other bin had small pieces of fabric. None of the fabrics here are really very big. They're one-ofs. But the colors here, this sort of green, minty green, a nice lilac, a bit of a print here, they all kind of work together in my palette that I'm going to use. Some teal. So if you have a couple of things that have all the colors in them, it helps to mix them and match them. But most of these pieces are not big enough to make squares. They're strips. And what do you do with strips but sew, I can't see the line, sew strips onto a piece of white fabric. And if I sew something directly on top of the 3.5 by 5 and flip it over, then it's going to keep the shape of the 3.5 by 5 inch square. I just have to trim off the edges. And because most of my strips here are not very wide, I have to make another additional flip and sew here, and that I'm going to make white. Now I want to make something that goes together like that. And in order to do that, I set these out on my sewing table so I can keep the orientation correct. If I alter the orientation and I get things upside down or backwards, and then they don't fit. If I do it on the wrong corner here, if I do them all on the wrong corner. So I have to be sure that I have them in the correct orientation. That's why I make these templates. These templates are telling me that's the line I have to sew on, but that's the direction I'm sewing and placing the fabric. So I've made some of these units, and it's not that hard to do. And I've selected my palette from a lot of leftovers that I have. Some of those treasured beauties that I store and keep. And I search and look through the places that I keep them. So here is a sample of what I'm going to make. And you see that there's left-hand side and right-hand side, and maybe they're not going to match in the middle here. They're not going to match, and they're definitely not going to match down here. But they're going to use the things that I have. I've created something that is going to work for me using the color palette that I've chosen, using the bits and pieces that I have. And when I sew all the 3.5 by 5 inch pieces together, in these colors, I think it's going to look jolly good. Now, sometimes when you are looking at the leftover things, some of the fabrics are not up to the standard of today's fabrics sometimes. And some of them are darn thin. And if they have a high polyester content in them and you iron them, they're going to shrink. So I have to be careful. Either if I use them by mistake, I have to not iron them on a high temperature, but they also don't look as nice because they're quite thin. The content is not there to give a body. And because it is white or off-white, I need to have something that is going to not show the color in the seam allowances behind here. So it's really important when pressing this, a lot of pressing. I press the seams open and I make sure that the colors here and here are folded to the inside so that on the outside that shadow doesn't come through. And most of the other color is going to be just down here along here, so it's important to give a good press to these. So that's what I'm going to make. I decide, I look through all my small leftover pieces, I consider the color palette and mix them together so it's kind of artistic, it's playful, it's interesting. They're not all exactly the same tone, they're lights and darks, but the color palette goes together well. Once I decide on the quilt's size and the purpose, whether it's a functional piece, a gift, or something artistic that I want to have hanging on my wall, a donation quilt, a baby quilt, a quilt for an older person, I really let my intuition and inspiration guide me. And this process brings me a lot of joy. So, yes, it may be a lot of work. And sometimes I work really hard to make something out of these treasured bits. But I also get a great deal of satisfaction from the fact that I've done something with the fabrics that people give me. Most of this is donated to me because people get rid of their stashes. And it brings me a great sense of achievement. And I've got a one of a kind, unique quilt that somebody will really love. So I make sustainable choices. I reduce waste. I reuse fabrics that people have donated to me that they do not want. And I recycle all of these bits. Embrace your creative side sometimes. Make something that gives you some artistic pleasure and work within these limits that make something meaningful and beautiful for you. I hope you enjoyed listening to what I have to say today, and I will keep you posted on the progress of this particular project. But that's my commentary for today. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. There's somebody out there that's always giving me a thumbs down and never telling me why they don't like my videos, but a lot of you really do enjoy them, and I'm very grateful for the conversations that some of us have together. So make something quilty. Have a good day and a good weekend. And you know, it's snowing outside here today. It's March. I don't know what day March 24th or 25th. I'm not sure what day it is. I never know what day it is. Anyway, have a good time making some quilts and try to use all those treasured bits. See you next time.